Welcome to In the Spotlight. I'm Abigail Pogrebin. Rabbi Edward Feld is the author most recently of the book we'll discuss today. It's called The Book of Revolutions, the battles of priests, prophets, and kings that birthed the Torah. Reviewers have called it stunning and an essential religious and cultural history. Rabbi Feld is also the senior editor of Machzor Lev Shalem and Siddur Lev Shalem for Shabbat and festivals. He is currently at work on a weekday Siddur in the series. Rabbi Feld's other publications include Joy, Despair, and Hope, Reading Psalms, and The Spirit of Renewal, Finding Faith After the Holocaust. Rabbi Feld has served as rabbi in residence at the Jewish Theological Seminary, JTS, Hillel director and college chaplain at Princeton, University of Illinois, Smith and Amherst colleges, and as rabbi and spiritual leader of the Society of the Advancement of Judaism. Welcome, Rabbi Feld, to the broadcast. It's great to have you.
Thank you for having me.
So this book, I just want to repeat the title, The Book of Revolutions, the battles of priests, prophets, and kings that birthed the Torah. So what is your elevator pitch for this book for those who might just be a little bit unsure of what world you're taking us into?
Well, the book combines both a biblical history and the history of the various authors of Torah, taken from the point of view of the legal codes that are in the Bible. Most biblical histories that talk about multi-authorship do the narrative portions.
You mean, when you say the narrative portions, the storytelling?
Right, from the beginning of creation to the entrance into the land.
And Jacob and his brothers and all those things. You're not as focused on kind of like the things that make the movies.
Not at all. Part of the problem is it's hard to date those sections, right? They're notably, Harold Bloom thought that the one author was a woman in the court of Solomon, and most recently Israel Knoll, who is an important Israeli biblical scholar, thinks that, no, it's not Solomon's time, it's the latest portion that came in. It's from just before the exile or just after the exile. So it's very hard to date narrative material, but the legal material was possible to date. And that's why it was possible to tell the biblical story through the legal material.
So before we get to what that legal material is, you mentioned the word authorship. And I wonder, just because obviously for anyone who is religious, they believed the Torah came from God. How do we reconcile the word authorship with the Torah?
So I think that we can think of revelation in the way we think of prophets speaking. That is to say, we don't just necessarily assume that every word came from God, but they were inspired by God. And in the same way, we can think of these words of Torah as being inspired by people who were trying to reach towards God in different moments in time.
You talk about what it means to read these biblical texts with the eyes of a historian. Explain what you mean by that.
Well, you can tell that certain pieces of Torah come from different periods of time. And it's important to understand what was going on in that time. What are the issues? What are the issues and the cultural background that out of which this material comes, and how does it speak out of its time, but to a greater time than it's only its time.
And when you, again, not to overemphasize the fact that there are authors here, but these are human beings. You are positing that human beings wrote this down. However they received it, they put it to paper, correct?
Yes. I mean, Moses too was a human being. If one wants to go there, and these are if one wants to think for a minute about Moses, one doesn't have to think of him as being just a secretary, taking a transcription from God, but the word of God goes through him. That is, he is speaking. And in the book of Deuteronomy, which is one of the books that I examine, one of the levels that I examine. In the book of Deuteronomy, Moses says, "This is my speech to you before I die," right? This is what I'm saying to you. So Moses says about himself that he's speaking. I'm speaking and I'm transmitting to you the word of God. That is, and I think that's, it's a different conception than to think of a kind of one-to-one relationship of the word of God to the word that's with us in Torah.
And before, again, we get to the levels, you say that Jews have not grasped the Torah's truths in their entirety because the parts do not ultimately quite fit together, which is just a provocative line. I just want people to understand what you mean about parts that actually don't align in some way.
Well, these three distinct law codes from different moments in time clearly at moments contradict each other. Most famously, there is a passage which says in Exodus, "Wherever you call upon me, I shall be with you," right? Meaning that you can build sanctuaries for me in all places in the world, and in all places in the land of Israel, certainly, and I will come to you there wherever you build it. And then Deuteronomy says, "Oh, in the place that I designate, that's where you should come and worship me."
Not everywhere.
So, not everywhere, but in Jerusalem, in the temple in Jerusalem. So different pieces of the Torah argue for a different relationship with place.
I want to read one of the other contradictions you cite. At one point in Exodus, we read that Moses, Aaron, his brother, and the elders sat down at Sinai and ate a festive meal as they viewed God. While later in Exodus, we read that no one can possibly see God and live. Yeah. Help us, again, understand that contradiction.
Yes, I think that what is so remarkable is that the Torah contains all these different theologies. A theology which says Moses saw God, right? And a theology which says no one can see God. A theology which says that the people of Israel saw God on Mount Sinai, and a theology in Deuteronomy which says no one saw God at Mount Sinai, you only heard a voice. So yeah, I think, and I argue this in the last chapter in the book, the greatness of Torah is precisely its pluralism. That is, to recognize that in putting the Torah together, the people who put it together realize that we're not going to capture truth in one clear statement, but truth has to be understood from its various perspectives, from different sides.
And again, before we start to unpack the categories, who is this book for? It seems like you have to have a fairly good, sophisticated grasp of kind of the elements or the basics of what it is to read the 5 books of Moses, to understand how you are in a way unpacking it through almost a legal lens. Am I right? Is this for kind of the average Jew in the pew? Do you feel like these are for scholars? This book is for scholars.
I meant it for lay people. I'm happy that some scholars have said that they've also learned something from it, but I've meant it for lay people. I can tell you already that I've heard back from both people who are shul goers and people who are not shul goers that they loved the book because it was so clear and laid out things in such a direct way. I wrote it almost from a novelistic point of view, that it should have, you can see the drama of the era and the battles that went on.
Yeah. And why was this book missing? Like, obviously we have huge libraries about the Torah. What did you feel was crying out for this investigation?
So I write in the introduction to the book, and it was really the spur for the book, that my students at the Jewish Theological Seminary, when I was rabbi in residence there, did not felt that when they learned biblical criticism, it destroyed their faith. Mm. And what I wanted to show was biblical criticism doesn't have to destroy your faith, but rather it can give you new spiritual insight, and you can see how different pieces that evolved at different moments in time can speak to you.
And just so people understand what you mean, when your students said that it destroyed their faith, what did they mean by that?
Well, they came in thinking Moses received the Torah on Mount Sinai, and the Torah presents itself as a certain kind of unity, right? From the story from creation to about the end of the land, and Moses is the chief character in giving the Torah.
And it's kind of a linear kind of progress that you're saying is disrupted by this idea a little bit.
That's right, and that at different moments in time, different pieces came into being, and that it was put together at a very late stage.
So let's talk about the covenant code in Exodus. If you can, I know all of these deserve hours-longs of hour-long answers, but can you just kind of, in a sense, boil down what is the covenant code and why, again, is it a tentpole of the three?
Well, we have these two chapters in Exodus immediately after the description of the Decalogue, and
the Decalogue is the Ten Commandments.
Yes, I don't like using the word commandments because they. But
I want people to know what we're talking about.
Right, sure, they aren't commands.
They're not commands. Correct.
Martin Buber says about them their I use speech, their direct speech. I am the God. You should. So in Exodus, there is this group of laws about which it calls itself the covenant code. It says this is Sefer HaBrit. This is and it has both a beginning part, which is like much of Near Eastern law, and then an ending part, which talks about the worship of one God and has in it a real ethical impulse. To give just one law that's included there, which is a kind of favorite of mine, it's if you see the donkey of your enemy falling under its load, you should help repack the donkey. That is to say, even if it's your enemy, there's someone and some animal in trouble here, and you shall be. And
something's asked of you, something's expected of you in that moment.
Yes, something ethical, and this combination of thinking of the demand to believe in God, to worship God, but also to do what is essential to God, which is to live an ethical life, is the peculiar central element of each of the three codes, and it's stamped here in the beginning in Exodus.
And the other two are the law code in Deuteronomy, holiness code in Leviticus. Am I correct?
Yes.
And you're saying all of those are united in a sense by an ethical charge?
Absolutely. I think that all three are deeply influenced by the prophetic teaching that God cares for the vulnerable, God cares for the widow, the orphan, the stranger. God, if you will, the essence of God is ethical concern.
It's interesting because I know there's sometimes anxiety among Jews that they can't kind of say on one foot what Judaism believes or stands for. And reading your book, it does kind of anchor us in exactly what you were talking about, that it isn't just our relationship with God and some kind of sense of the divine being with us, but what we owe or what our responsibility is. Is that too kind of contemporary a read?
I think that was the surprise to me in doing this book, was to see how each of these codes are really influenced by that strong prophetic impulse, both of saying both, of trying to hold on to both a belief in God, but also that the belief in God means that you must create a certain kind of society, a society of social equity.
You write, God wishes us, this is when you were talking about the holiness code, God wishes each of us to behave in such a way that our very hearts are transformed. I love that line. There's a beauty, obviously almost a poetry to it. But what should we take from that concept of our hearts being transformed? Transformed from what to what?
Well, here, I mean, the holiness code's special contribution is to see that it's not simply that we obey God's commands or that we stand in relationship to God as the covenant code would have us, but that we try, in fact, to imitate, to be almost a godly people. And that imitation means that we have to be in touch with some part of ourselves that is trying to live out a holy life.
And you are talking about how these biblical ideas were not just in contradiction, but sort of in conflict. So, I mean, people were arguing, am I right? In some sense, maybe across generations. But you write, I hope readers come to realize the difficulty biblical ideas encountered in their own time before they triumphed. So help us tease that out a little bit.
Well, we have found more than 1,000, actually thousands of little figurines of women with holding their breasts, obviously fertility goddesses, in the land of Israel associated with Jewish settlement. That is to say, there was a pervasive worship of a consort of God, Astarte. There was, when we read in Josiah's reform of the temple, we read of his stopping the women who were weaving houses to house the goddess, to house Astarte. So there in the temple in Jerusalem, there was a worship of multiple divinities. Not to say that God wasn't supreme. They thought of Adonai as being supreme, but God also had, there were other divinities that sort of worked, and you could worship many divinities. So that issue of the purity of belief was a constant fight in Israel.
Talk to me about the high places. What are they, and how are they eradicated?
Well, again, the high places were places where you could, I think in an ancient mentality, come closer to the divinity, right? And in the high places, you would go to the top of the mountain and you could try to reach. But what was worshipped there was you would offer incense, or you would have a tree that was planted. The tree was a symbol of Astarte, was a symbol of the female goddess. What we have is a variety of rituals that represent challenges to this notion of you worship a single God. And so the prophets, and most notably Deuteronomy, really excoriates this behavior. And in the reign of Josiah, what it meant was tearing down these altars that were there, tearing down the trees that were there, tearing down all the images that could possibly vie with worship of a single divinity. And it is a kind of war.
You keep mentioning Josiah. I don't think he's in the Jewish vernacular the way King Solomon is, for instance, or King David. So tell us, if you can, just briefly, who is he? Why is he so important to this?
So his father, Manasseh, reigned for some 40 years and brought encouraged the worship, this kind of worship that I was describing, worshiping on high places, worshiping of Astarte, and so forth, and became a kind of vassal of the Assyrian Empire, which was the great empire of the time. Josiah, his son, Josiah wasn't quite his son. Josiah's father was assassinated. That is, after Manasseh died, Manasseh's son was made king and was assassinated. And Josiah was 6 years old when he was chosen to be king and brought up by priests in the temple. And when he reaches his maturity at age 20, he quote, cleanses the temple and cleanses the worship. And we associate the finding of the book of Deuteronomy with the reign of Josiah. The book of Kings tells us that Shaphan, the high priest, found this book in the temple, and Huldah, the priest, the prophetess, said, "Oh, that is surely the book of God." And we associate that with the book of Deuteronomy, which was promulgated at that time.
And then you talk about our exile, and we all, I think more about our return, but not so much about what happened when we were in Babylon. You describe the community as having been very strong, and can you just describe why?
Well, unlike the Assyrian exile of northern Israel, where we have the 10 lost tribes and they've kind of disappeared from Jewish history. What the Babylonians did was take all the exiles from the land of Israel and plunk them down in a certain area in Babylonia, so that they were able to maintain a cohesive community in Babylonia, unlike the 10 lost tribes. And it became a very strong community and preserved all the materials from the first temple and brought it together. And they are responsible for both this preservation and also for its conglomeration in what we call the Torah. And the evidence for it is that when two Babylonians, Babylonian exile, Jews in Babylonia who come back to the land of Israel, Ezra and Nehemiah, the people in the land of Israel know nothing of what they're talking about when they say, "Oh, this is the Torah," and so forth. So the Torah is
like they're speaking a different language.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, they are upset that the people in the land of Israel are beginning to speak a different language and not Hebrew.
So, Eddie, we're running out of time, but I just want to get a sense before we go as to how you managed to do your research for this, kind of put the pieces together, because you've obviously studied this forever and taught it. You know, how did you just sort of sit down and say, this is how I'm going to go about charting this course and kind of weaving a different story than some of us have had in our own kind of biblical education?
Whatever I've written starts out with a question. And I don't know the answer to the question when I start. So my question was, what are these elements, and how are they different from each other, and how were they put together? So my question was, how can I go about understanding the history of Torah? And these pieces came to me as I started writing, rather than having an idea of where I wanted to go and doing the research for it. And each time it was a question of, oh, how did that happen? And I go through the scholarly literature to discover what people were saying about it.
Did it take you a long time? Just practically?
20 years.
How many?
20 years.
Wow. Unbelievable. So finally, you write in the conclusion of your book that within our biblical literary tradition, quote, there is a constant falling away, but also a constant hope for a new beginning. So what is it that you hope for the new beginning of this historical moment in global Jewish life? We're lucky enough to be speaking during the days of awe after the Jewish New Year, 5783. Can you describe kind of personally and in the context of your book?
So two things. One is that what came as a surprise to me, and which became the conclusion of the book, was the pluralism of Torah. That is to say, the decision that even though we have contradictory material here, we're going to include it all. We're not going to make a decision about what's right. We're not going to have one way, but we're going to have many ways. And that message about pluralism, I think, is a most important message about it for our time, of how to live with diversity, how to live with opposite opinions, how to say that truth is not owned by anybody, but everybody has aspects of truth. And it involves our political life, certainly, but involves our Jewish life. I mean, I'm so happy that we have an Orthodoxy, a Reform, a Conservative Judaism, Reconstructionist Judaism. It is, and if any of these elements would fall away, if any of them would be desiccated, we'd be poorer, I think. We're a rich community precisely because of our differences. The second.
Thank you, Rabbi Feld. Yeah, that is, I think, a perfect note to end on. And I will say, sometimes it sounds almost utopian, but in a way, our texts and your book reminds us that it existed. This sense of upholding and valuing not just dialogue but difference is a lesson we're in sore need of today.
Thank you so much, Abby.
Thank you so much. Again, the book, for anyone who wants to buy it, it's on Amazon. Yes, Eddie?
It's on Amazon. It's on Kindle.
It's on Kindle. The Book of Revolutions, the battles of priests, prophets, and kings that birthed the Torah. Thank you so much, Rabbi Feld. Thank you to the audience. It's always good to be with you on In the Spotlight. I'll see you next time. I'm Abigail Pogrebin.